You talk. You explain. You choose your words carefully. So you don't hurt him, don't offend him, don't start a conflict. Again and again you try to make it clear that you're tired, that you need support, that you can't carry everything alone. And he seems to listen. He nods. Sometimes he even agrees. But time passes, and nothing changes. If you feel that conversations only drain you and lead nowhere, this video is important to watch until the end. Because the problem here is not how you speak, and the solution begins in a completely different place than where you're used to looking. You're not silent. That's important to say right away. You speak. You explain. You try to be honest and calm. You choose your words carefully, so you don't hurt him, so you don't offend him, so the conversation doesn't turn into a conflict. You talk about how hard it is for you, about how tired you are, about how you need support, not just someone being physically at him. And he seems to listen. He may nod. He may say, I understand. Sometimes he even promises that he'll try. But time passes, and you find yourself in the exact same place again. You do more again. You take more on yourself again. You adjust again. And at some point an internal question appears, one that's very hard to say out loud. Why do I speak, and nothing changes? You replay the conversations in your head. You think about where you said it wrong, where you were too soft, or on the contrary too sharp. You may notice yourself preparing for conversations in advance, thinking through phrases, looking for the right moment. But every time the result is the same. And here it's important to understand one thing. The problem is not that you speak badly, and not that he's deaf or indifferent. The problem is that you're speaking from a position where your words carry no weight. You speak, but you keep doing. You explain, but you keep compensating. You ask, but you don't allow reality to show its consequences. And this is a very subtle point, because you're not doing this intentionally. You're not manipulating. You just want things to work. You want calm. You want no chaos. You don't want anyone to suffer. And so every time he doesn't step in, you step in even more. You take on responsibility not because you want control, but because you want stability. But this is exactly where conversations begin to lose their power. Because words are always weaker than actions. When you say, I'm exhausted, but continue to carry everything, reality doesn't hear the words, sees that you're coping. When you say, I need help, but still close everything yourself, the system learns that help is optional. And over time your words stop being a signal. They become background noise. That's deeply painful, because it feels like you're not being heard. But the truth is you are being heard. Nothing changes because changing isn't necessary. And this isn't about a bad man. And it isn't about your mistake. It's about the dynamic you're in. You're speaking from the position of someone who has already taken on too much. And from that position, words rarely change anything. And here a very dangerous feeling appears, that if you stop speaking, stop explaining, stop trying, nothing will be left. But that's not true. Because next we'll talk about why constant conversations often only deepen burnout, and where the real shift actually begins, the point where you're not just heard, but where the reality of the relationship itself starts to change. When you start the conversation again, you're not hoping for a miracle. You just want to finally be heard. You're not speaking out of whim, not out of a desire to argue, but because inside staying silent has become too heavy. You explain that you're tired, that you need support, that you can't carry everything alone anymore. And every time you try to speak the right way, calmly, without blame, without pressure, you think, if I'm softer, he won't shut down. If I'm more honest, he'll understand. If I explain one more time, something will shift. But instead of relief, you feel emptier and emptier, because the conversation ends, and life stays the same. And at some point you start to notice, the more you talk, the less strength you have inside. Why does this happen? Because in this situation, you're not speaking from an equal position. You're speaking from the position of someone who has already taken on too much. You're speaking when the home is already held together by you, when daily life is already organized by you, when problems are already solved through your effort. and your words sound against a reality where everything keeps working anyway. You can say that you're exhausted, but reality shows something else. You're coping. You can say that you need help, but the system sees help isn't necessary, and that's why conversations don't become a breaking point. They become part of the same pattern. You speak. He listens. Nothing changes. You do even more. And each of these conversations doesn't just fail to help. It slowly wears you down from the inside. Because you invest hope. You open up. You wait for a response. And what you get back is emptiness. And in that moment, it's very easy to start doubting yourself. You might think, maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I'm exaggerating. Maybe I really want too much. But that's not true. You're just trying to change actions with words, when what actually needs to change is the position itself. And as long as you continue to smooth things over, adjust, close the gaps, rescue, the conversations will repeat. Because the system isn't experiencing real pressure from reality. It isn't facing consequences. And here it's important to say one hard, but deeply freeing thing. You are not obligated to convince a grown adult to take responsibility. If a person is truly ready to take responsibility, they don't need long explanations. They respond not to words, but to changes in reality. But as long as reality stays the same, conversations become just a way to release tension and then take everything back onto yourself. And this is one of the fastest paths to burnout, because you speak, but you don't see a response. You hope, but you don't see movement. And the longer this continues, the more that builds inside you is not anger, but emptiness. You start speaking less, explaining less, hoping less. And this is no longer about conflict. It's about shutting down. And next we'll talk about what actually happens to a woman when she lives for too long in this state of invisibility. When you haven't been heard for a long time, it doesn't look like a dramatic crisis. It doesn't happen suddenly. It doesn't feel like an explosion. It happens slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly. At first, you're just more tired than usual. Then you notice it's harder to talk about yourself. Then you catch yourself starting conversations less often, because you already know how they'll end. Not with a fight, but with emptiness. You stop expecting a response. You stop hoping. You stop believing that words really matter. And at that moment, something important shifts inside. You begin to close off. Not because you're cold, and not because you don't care, but because openness without response is deeply painful. You may notice that it's harder to be soft, harder to be patient, harder to be who you used to be. You start conserving yourself. You share less, explain less, talk less about what truly matters to you. Because every time you speak and get no response, you lose a little more energy, and gradually you begin to live, not from connection, but from function. You do what needs to be done. You keep the household going. You maintain stability. But inside there's less and less that feels alive. You might feel irritation. That comes out of nowhere. Over small things. Over trivial moments. You might catch yourself being sharp, distant, wanting to be alone. And then you blame yourself for it. But this isn't your personality getting worse. You didn't just change. This is a protective response. Because when you aren't heard for a long time, the psyche looks for a way to survive. And it finds it in distance. You begin investing less emotionally. Because you no longer see the point. You start living as if there's someone next to you, but no real support. And this is one of the hardest states to be in. Because formally you're not alone. But emotionally, you're always on your own. You carry the decisions. You carry the responsibility. You carry the tension. And the longer this goes on, the more you drift away not only from him, but from yourself. You may stop feeling what you want, what you enjoy, what brings you joy. You live in I have to mode, not in I want to mode. And the most dangerous part is this. You may start thinking that something is wrong with you, that you've become too demanding, too cold, too irritable. But the truth is, you've lived too long without emotional response. A person cannot keep speaking into emptiness and stay alive inside. And when you're not heard for a long time, you begin to disappear. Not physically, but emotionally. You're there, but it's as if you aren't. You do things, but you aren't seen. You speak, but your words carry no weight. And this slowly destroys not only the relationship, but your sense of yourself. Because intimacy is impossible where there is no response. Partnership is impossible where one person keeps explaining and the other merely exists. And next we'll talk about where exactly the point is at which this dynamic can change. Not through pressure, not through ultimatums, and not through even more words, but through returning to you, your weight, your place, and your reality. When you've lived for a long time with the feeling that you aren't being heard, a very natural desire appears to try one more time, to say it differently, to find new words, to choose a better moment. You might think, if I explain it more calmly, he'll hear me. If I'm firmer, he'll understand how serious this is. If I say it one more time, it will finally sink in. And this logic makes perfect sense, because conversation feels like the safest way to change something. But this is exactly where the key mistake is hidden, the one that can keep you stuck in this place for years. You're trying to change behavior with words, while staying in the exact same position. You speak, but you keep living as if nothing can really change. You explain, but you keep compensating. You hope, but you don't change the reality around you. And every new conversation happens against the same background. The house is holding together. Daily life functions. Problems get solved. Life goes on. Because of you. That's why conversations don't become a turning point. They become part of the familiar pattern. It's like trying to shake a wall with words, without removing the support that's holding it up. And the longer this goes on, the stronger your sense of helplessness becomes. Because you're doing everything right, but nothing changes. And here it's very important to hear this, not as blame, but as clarity. You're not stuck because you explain badly. You're stuck because you've been holding up a system for too long, where your voice is not the deciding factor. As long as you keep smoothing things over, rescuing, covering gaps, adjusting yourself, your words cannot become the solution. Not because they're wrong, but because actions are always stronger than words. And this is where fear appears. Because if you stop talking, then what? If you stop explaining, won't things get even worse? This fear is completely understandable, because conversation has become the only form of influence you've allowed yourself. But it's the one thing that has stopped working. That doesn't mean you should go silent. It means you need to stop hoping that words will replace reality. The turning point doesn't begin when you find the perfect wording. It begins when you stop holding everything together alone. This isn't about punishment, and it's not about manipulation. It's about the moment when you stop doing extra things out of fear that everything will fall apart without you. Because if a relationship exists only because you constantly keep it afloat, that's not dialogue. That's survival. And it's exactly here, when you stop endlessly explaining and start noticing, where you automatically take on more than you should, that the first real shift appears. And in the next part, we'll talk about what actually begins to change when you take a different position, without scandals, without ultimatums, but with real consequences. When you stop hoping that one more conversation will fix everything and begin living from a different position. Changes don't happen right away. And it's important to understand that the first changes are not external. They're not about him, and not even about the relationship. They happen inside you. You stop being tense all the time, not because things suddenly get easier, but because you stop waiting. You stop replaying conversations in your head. You stop searching for the right words. You stop thinking about how else you could explain things. And with that, the feeling that you constantly need to prove something begins to fade. You no longer live in the mode of, if I say it the right way, I'll finally be heard. You begin to notice reality as it actually is, without justifying it, without blaming, without smoothing it over. And that's exactly what gives you grounding. When you stop automatically compensating for everything, life starts showing you who is actually capable of what. Not immediately, not dramatically, But the pauses become more noticeable. The empty spaces become clearer. You may feel anxiety, because before, you were the one keeping everything moving. Now you allow some things not to happen. And here there are two possible scenarios. The first, there is a man next to you who is capable of taking responsibility, but for a long time lived in a system where it wasn't necessary. When you stop carrying everything, he meets reality. First, this may look like irritation, confusion, resistance. But if he has inner maturity, he begins to step in, not because you pressure him, but because the space is no longer occupied by you. The second scenario, and this one is just as important, if the person next to you is used to living off your efforts and is not ready to be a second adult, this becomes visible, not through scandals, but through emptiness. And that is painful, because you begin to see that for a long time you weren't living in partnership, but in an illusion. But here is the crucial difference. Before, you paid for that illusion with yourself, with your energy, with your emotional state, with your life. Now you pay with clarity, and clarity is not destruction. It is liberation. You stop doing what's unnecessary. You stop rescuing. You stop smoothing things over. And for the first time in a long while, you begin to feel not like a function, but like a human being. You begin to hear yourself, to understand where it hurts, where you are living against yourself. And even if nothing around you has changed yet, something solid appears inside you. Not rigidity, not coldness, but a sense of, I am no longer disappearing. And this is crucial, because any real change in a relationship is only possible when you are no longer willing to live for two. And in the final part, we'll talk about what's important to hold on to, so you don't slip back into the old pattern, even if fear, habit, or hope tries to pull you back. When you reach this point, a strange feeling often appears, as if it's become quieter, as if there's less noise inside, but at the same time more questions. You're no longer living in constant tension, no longer trying to explain everything all the time, no longer waiting for the next conversation to magically fix things. And it's exactly here that the temptation arises, to go back, not because things got worse, but because the old pattern was familiar. You knew how to survive in it. You knew that if things got hard, you would just take on a little more. And this is the most dangerous moment, because the habit of living for two is very quiet. It doesn't return through big decisions, but through thoughts like, I'll just do it myself, it's easier right now. He won't manage anyway. It's faster if I do it. Now's not the time. Each time it sounds reasonable. Each time it feels temporary. But it's exactly these temporary moments that turn into years. That's why it's important to hold on to one simple thing right now. You don't have to be strong for a relationship to exist. If a relationship survives only because you keep enduring everything, that's not partnership. That's survival. And this isn't an accusation. It's a fact. You don't have to be the foundation. If there's another adult next to you, you don't have to smooth things over to keep them from getting worse. You don't have to sacrifice yourself to preserve the appearance of calm. You have the right to pause, to uncertainty, to not knowing how things will turn out, because clarity isn't about having answers. Clarity is about no longer lying to yourself. You stop saying I'm fine when you're not. You stop calling exhaustion just a phase. You stop explaining to yourself why living like this is acceptable. You start calling things by their real names, and that doesn't make you harsh. It makes you honest. Maybe there's a person next to you who can grow in this reality. Maybe there isn't. But that's no longer the main question. The main question is this: do you stop living as if your value is measured by how much you can endure? You don't have to make decisions right now. You don't have to destroy anything. You don't have to issue ultimatums. Sometimes the strongest step is simply stopping what's unnecessary, stopping caring what was never meant to be yours alone, stopping proving your importance through exhaustion. You don't have to be irreplaceable to be valuable. And if after this video you don't feel inspiration, but calm clarity, that's a good sign, Because real change doesn't start with emotions, starts the moment you are no longer willing to lose yourself, just so everything looks normal. And if you're here now, that means this moment has already arrived.